Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Peter Davis, managing partner of Interplay. I'm on a mission to help entrepreneurs advance society, and this podcast is definitively part of that effort. Welcome back. We took a moment to breathe through the end of the summer. We are now ripping and roaring, ramping up the podcast activity again. Today, we've got a really interesting conversation with a fellow named Ryan Ansin. Now, Ryan has a rich background in a couple of dimensions. He's part of a very prominent and successful family in Boston, but has spent his career as a serial entrepreneur. The undertone of his entrepreneurial journey, which I think is just fascinating, is this real dedication to integrity and ultimately a degree of social entrepreneurship. So we try to unravel that today. We try to talk about how what he's doing is motivated, how it works, how to approach business a little bit differently with an ethical lens. Now, he's working on his new company, Father Form. We don't cover that too much during this conversation. We focus more on the underlying principles, but I hope it is helpful, and I hope you enjoy. Ryan, thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
Very cool. So we've known each other for years at this point, and I was excited to have you on the pod and chat with you a little bit. I've done a bit of research, and I knew a lot about your background before, but it's got more color. I think one of the most salient threads is how thoughtful you are around ethics and morals. And I think it's unusual at the level you go to. So I'd like to start off in that realm.
Okay.
What does ethical manufacturing mean?
All right. Great question. When I think of ethical manufacturing, I envision myself holding whatever that item is or wearing whatever that item is and projecting across the entire supply chain and where it came from, all the way from the earth to the material, to the people, to the distribution, and wondering without much judgment to the each individual detail, wondering can I be proud of each element? And so across the early part of my career, I was often asked a similar question of what is impact investing? And everyone had their own answer. Flash forward to 38, when I have a 3.5-year-old and a 5-year-old, I think, am I going to be proud to tell them that I invested in this there on my own behalf or for them? And similarly, as I put clothes on my kids and food in their bellies, do I think that the supply chain for whatever that item is morally upstanding across its life cycle? I think when I was preparing to have a kid and knowing a lot about ethical manufacturing, I was really disturbed by the fact that it was highly likely that my children's clothes were going to be made by children. And so if you start there and then just kind of navigate outward across a vortex of all of the things that we touch, including what's going on this computer right now, lithium, tungsten, copper, all these elements that are in our computer, to a degree, this conversation is created thanks to the possibility of slavery in our supply chain. The fact that nobody starts Zoom conversations that way is kind of befuddling to me. It can be exhausting. I'm sure for my wife, it's exhausting for her husband to look at a menu and to have researched almost everything on that menu, or to see her husband almost never buy new clothing for that same reason. But it becomes equally wonderfully rewarding to wear the thing, to hold the thing that the entire supply chain when those moments occur, whether it's broccoli that you're eating or a shirt that you're wearing. And so that creates its own really positive feedback.
So I came across this term in an interview you gave about a prior cannabis operation you had going, which we'll touch on later.
Sure.
And you threw it out, and it has a wonderful ring to it.
Yeah.
When I think about some of the social impact, ethical impact investing, all this category,
yeah,
One of the challenges is really defining it,
Sure.
right? Ethical manufacturing, I intuitively recognize all of the things you just said, but I don't know that I could measure it or enforce it based on that description.
Depends.
So how do you think about how do people know if they're being ethical when they manufacture something? And what is the standard?
Yeah, different countries and different industries have different standards. Um, a great way to research this question is to look at the chocolate industry
Hmm. Why?
because it's a commodity, because it gets blended. Cacao beans get blended at different points in the supply chain, because there are so many companies trying to do good in that space with certain segments. And there's a, a, a gold star premium, I think, probably this company called Fair Afrique, who's the first company that I know of to manufacture the chocolate on the continent of Africa, as well as the entire supply chain leading up to it. And then you have Tony's Chocolonely and Beyond Good and a group in that realm who have really, really upped the game of standards at the earth level, the human level, and the supply chain level. But I believe most of them still manufacture in factories that have blended commerce and distribution. And so they also work with some of the brands that don't have as thorough treatment across the supply chain. So at each step, there are different standards and different mechanisms that help and don't help and are traceable and not traceable. Why I think chocolate is so interesting is it's a little bit like children's clothes being made by children. It's perverse to think that something that's supposed to bring us so much joy and represent such goodness has such a devastating pathway.
What happens in the chocolate supply chain?
Ground level in the chocolate supply chain, there's deforestation, there's child labor, there's collection of the cacao beans in a really inefficient way. So all of the husks in the supply chain, when the cacao beans, forgive me, it's been a while since I researched this one, but the insides that get made into chocolate, the rest, the husk, which is probably 70% or something of the biomass, generally gets left in the field. So just each level, there's lots of room for improvement. Point is, I think it's going to be very, very hard for any industry to make broad changes across its entire supply chain, but ethics, morals, and regulations are put in place per country, per stage, that incrementally make change over time.
Has there been, over time, has there been a clear, measurable progress in terms of building more ethics in the supply chain? Is there an index, or how do people get a sense of where we've come from and where we are now?
Yeah. The answer is sorely yes. And there are professionals that can give you a better answer of go to this website per industry, and here's how you'll see it. My contrarian viewpoint on how these changes are made is that it's a little bit like a sandwich effect, that small companies, think Tony's Chocolonely, that grow, and boy, are they growing as I understand it. They prove that there is a societal demand, and then it's the big guys that have to make the sweeping change. When I was investigating for a couple of years the post-consumer textile waste issue and advanced fabric that are less detrimental to the environment or to the people along the supply chain, I really became convinced that some of these smaller, smart startups, they were really neat at pineapple skins into whatever fabric, linen alternatives, for example. But it was H&M, Zara, Walmart, these groups that had to make the change. And I think that they are. They're also the punching bags, but they are the ones that want the change. These companies are often led by really thoughtful people, It's hard to move the tanker ships of those businesses. But even just before this Zoom call, podcast, I saw that Pepsi was ranked 23rd most sustainable business out of 250 by some group. And I'm sure there's real legitimacy to that. It has to change within the biggest groups to make a dent. And we need to prove to them that it's worthy, because the CFO has to sign off on it.
Is there a clear driver of progress on this front between consumer sentiment and demand for ethical products or government regulation? Does one of those lead and the other lag?
I think the consumer awareness leads. Very interestingly, I was asked to consider participating. I'm not sure how yet, but consider participating in the development of a new growth stage private equity fund dedicated to some of these themes that we're talking about. And they're very adept guys. These one built a multi-billion, single billions platform, and one was CEO of a $100 billion plus bank. Very thoughtful, very capable guys. And on their deck, they lead with words like conscious consumer. And I pushed back because they're both more capable than I think that term generates the sentiment surrounding. I think conscious consumer, I think of better for you tea, of boba punch, of Lululemon's made out of a slightly better material. What they're actually really pushing towards and capable of is manifesting and empowering the changes, funding the changes that come from an aware public. And I think that's the difference. It's not yuppies wanting slight betterment and wanting their ego to be stroked by whatever brand they're wearing. It's the fact that the masses can be aware that supply chains of salmon can go onto the blockchain at a cost-effective price right now. That's wild. That has never been the case until this year. Like literally these consumer level mass adoption policies are viable only now. It was so easy to brush it under the carpet up until now, and it's going to become a lot more difficult, and people are going to be held accountable.
And that's because we can now track individual products through a supply chain in a way that wasn't easy to do from a technology standpoint prior.
For sure.
That's the point.
For sure.
When did you become a social entrepreneur? When did this click? You mentioned earlier in this conversation that you're very motivated by your children, and implicitly you're implying you want to put a better world for them. I think that's the follow-on. But you were starting companies and acting on this long before. So what was do you know the moment when these values kind of started to anchor business decision-making?
Yeah. Well, I couldn't tell you the precise moment because I don't really have a working memory around this time. But the first effort, the film production company that became a not-for-profit called Every Person Has a Story, that was what I felt in the moment, the opposite of one of our family businesses, my cousin's family, not mine, but in media. Our uncle was really, really good at local news and being very welcoming to losing national affiliates, NBC, Fox, etc., in favor of more local news. And what he was at the forefront of, I don't know if the first person, but he was at the forefront of, instead of paying the Ron Burgundies their celebrity level salaries as news anchors, he paid young, energetic, good-looking folks to go hold on to a light post and be in the hurricane. And so he did that in Miami. area and then in the Boston area. And that's great. But I used to, as a young teenager, I used to think that it's perverse that the news families, the bottled water families, and the grocery store families all make money around a snowstorm, whether it happens or not. And I didn't like the nature of reality not being saleable, and it's still not saleable. Good news doesn't sell as well as bad news.
That was your Uncle Edmund, is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he was a fairly successful media tycoon, right? Is the kind of the way to put it out there.
I don't know if he was a tycoon at all, but he was a very patient deal maker. And what I think he did best was align the best parts of broadcast with the not-for-profits in whatever region he was working within. He did it, and my cousins still do a really good job of balancing profits with the fact that we have an obligation to help groups tell their story, who deserve it and who might not get press otherwise. And so, in a way, in my early teens, by going to war zones, post-war zones, what I thought of as just underexposed areas around the world, and bringing media, bringing eyeballs to Sudan outside of Darfur, Sierra Leone outside of Blood Diamonds, Cambodia outside of the rebuilding post-Pol Pot, Haiti outside of Hurricane Tomas and cholera epidemic and the earthquake. I wanted to show the rest of reality. And it just made sense. Ultimately, like years later, I met, and he won't remember this, but I met Peter Diamandis, and he said the easiest way to make $1 billion is to help 1 billion people. I thought, oh, that's pretty neat. So I can do this work and maybe perpetuate what Sidney Ansin and Ed Ansin and Zon Ansin and Ted Ansin might have done. It makes more sense to me to work the way I expressed it when I was president of Family Office Association was it makes more sense to align your operating companies, your investments, and your philanthropy. It makes more sense for them all to work in the same direction. For you to make all this money in oil and gas and then realize that we have a climate change problem is just inefficient. We only have so much time on this earth, and so we should work towards efficiency.
Ryan, this is the thread I wanted to pull, right? You come from a successful family. You've been a successful entrepreneur in your own right. But uniquely, there's a lot of people with that profile. You've had this really ethically bound orientation. And I think you may have just given a little bit of a glimmer. I'm wondering how someone gets that so early. What is the recipe for instilling that in other people who are thinking about entrepreneurship? You know, I'm a deep believer that entrepreneurship is the driver of social change. You know, most people are in the hamster wheel chasing the cheese. They're trying to make that money. Nothing wrong with that. But they may not be paying attention to the fact that turning the wheel powers society.
Yeah.
So you gave a little glimmer here in that uncle, not a tycoon, an ethical actor. Cousin still doing that. Is there some ethos in the family, some language used that distilled or disseminated these values in a way that has shaped how you've approached business?
Yeah. So first of all, I feel 10x richest in case study. So yes, uncle, yes, cousins. Watching my grandfather navigate business, investments, but mostly community and philanthropy, and how those things were woven, ultimately created a wonderful life, a life not void of struggle. Being a bisexual man at the time that he was, thought gay, then bisexual, and not easy times. But as a young guy, watching family members navigate these situations and purposely weave the situations, purposely weave business and friendship and philanthropy, being part of the fabric of communities. It was and is the most marvelous education I could ever get. So are there statements or family mantras? I need to think about that. But I think one that is sitting on my shoulder right now, is that ultimately we are only answering to ourselves in the mirror. You know what you've done. And the more we know, go back to the conversation about the supply chain, but the more we know, the more critical we should be about ourselves. We should hold ourselves to this degree of accountability if we know, once we know. A friend of mine uses the expression, you can't unlearn it, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't unlearn that. That's what I think, if there's one thing that I think that I do well, I think that I'm able to hold troublesome concepts in limbo inside of myself and observe them all. So I in my daughter, I think of her surface area of emotion and the density of the cilia of her feelings. And I think that by growing up and being diagnosed with depression and unipolar depression, bipolar depression, being in therapy from 7 years till now, which gives me 31 years of therapy, of all different modalities, I'm very comfortable digging, and grabbing those feelings like artifacts on a shelf, looking at those feelings and working with them. And I think most people don't take the time to do that. And ultimately, it's all just noise. And so what you learn about the chocolate or what you learn about the tomato from Food Chain, it was Sanjay Rawal 15 years ago, whenever he made that movie, that still lives in me every time I look at a menu. So that's one thread, Mark. A second thread that I think is really important and almost nobody talks about with my background broadly, as you put it, is I graduated college having barely graduated less than 3 years after taking a year and a half off to run the film production stuff. And I graduated without any debt. And so I was able to take risks. Most people, you have to chase the cheese. This is just a mathematical certainty. You have to. And thank God. Thank God.
Is this ethical framing, is it a luxury to be able to perceive the world, to evaluate this way? Or is it something that, regardless of financial stressors, debt, otherwise, everyone else can frame in? Question. And I want to bring that also with, you talked about your grandfather had modeled some wonderful community and philanthropy frameworks. What were those? Yeah.
Sure. Let's talk about the luxury. I'm just writing that down first. And then RMA leadership. So is it a luxury? I think it depends. Just watched a YouTube of somebody growing enough organic, beautiful food for their family of 4 children, so family of 6, on 1/8 of an acre. And they had a bunch of food to sell beyond that. They made a choice to live in a certain region to grow organic food and to put it into their bodies. Not everybody can make that choice, but they're not swimming in cash. They've made decisions. They moved to that region. That's something Americans don't do anymore. We don't move. I'm glad that's being talked about in the media right now. We don't move for opportunity anymore. Part of that is the increased rates, but we are at a historic average. We are not at historic highs for interest rates. So I just don't buy that. Americans don't move anymore for opportunity. So I think part of it is a luxury, Mark, but part of it is not. If you try to keep up with the Joneses, then it would be seen as a luxury to buy only things that you know where they came from. But in a world where there are 4 billion pairs of shoes going to landfill or to secondary market right now, you can get shoes that are secondhand, that are not used at all on Poshmark, and you can do just fine. And so I think if you're keeping up with the Joneses, It's impossible to do that and know where your stuff comes from. If you're not, and you're a little bit creative and you're resourceful and you realize that there's joy in the cultivation, literal cultivation and figurative, it's a real possibility. But I do recognize that that might be the bell curve. That's not everybody.
Thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit. You've done some wonderful entrepreneurial ventures. We've talked a little bit about Every Person Has a Story, which I think you started in high school, which is incredible. You also did Revolutionary Farms, a cannabis play. It was number 4 on the Inc. 5000. So you've had some hits, but along the way, you were also, as you mentioned, the president of the Family Office Association. If you could give one tactical advice bit to families listening, rich or poor, on how to train grit in their children as you have young children, what are you doing? Is there one tactical thing that you think really works?
The first thing that comes to mind, I'll give you 2. One thing's my grandfather and one from my dearest friend here in Boston. From my grandfather, it's you can't spoil a 3-year-old with love. You can't build their confidence strongly enough. So yes, it's grit, but it brings me to the second point of someone, husband and wife, who are building a preeminent 0 to 5-year-old education center here in Boston. And their mantra to their child, now soon to be children, is you can do hard things. So it doesn't matter what it is. My son right now is waking up at 30 minutes before the right time, and he was trying to get us to go and find his little Yoda, his little sound machine affair. And whether it's that or climbing a fence or whatever else, you can do hard things. You can do hard things. I think it's important that that's inside of our children. And each time there's an opportunity for them to stumble, to support the process of stumbling and to fall in love with you learning. I'm getting into their brains that any mistake is an opportunity for learning. Any slide down what they thought was going to be a climb up is an opportunity for learning. And that, I think, is a posture for our whole lives. There's a Zen mindset of you can't gain access at the top. You can't gain information at the tippity top of the mountain. You need to be in the valley where the rivers flow towards you. So I think that that's a state of humility, state of reality. And to the degree that we can nail that into our kids, that where there is friction, there is learning. So friction and grit are 2 fairly synonymous words. Where there's friction, there's learning. And where there's learning, there's betterment. And for these families, another one from Ron, know a little about a lot and a lot about a little. That combination makes you really useful to other people. You can connect with other people really well. And when there's an opportunity that you're holding a really specific card in a 7-card game and you see it, because you have a broad enough perspective on the horizon, you can deploy those things. That whole combination, friction creates learning, learning creates grit, and curiosity will just bring you so far. That's kind of the combination.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate you doing this.
So happy to be here. Nice to chat.
Huge thanks to Ryan for doing this today. I asked him some tough questions. He kind of continued to play ball, which I'm grateful for. I think these different perspectives, these implicit layers of how people are viewing the world and behaving are sometimes more interesting than the actions that we're all focused on. It's the substrate, the subtext of the actions, why people are motivated to do what they do is fascinating. So I hope it was helpful. I hope you learned something, and maybe it will inform how you think about your next decision. Thanks for listening.